Supertanskiii is a content creator and political commentator on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. I caught up with her to discuss what inspires her to make her content, as well as her favorite moments from the last year, and much more. All right, well, first of all, was there an event or moment in time or in your life that compelled you to start making your videos?
The catalyst, I would say, for doing it online and making the content online was definitely the pandemic. I felt like I really needed an outlet for what the government were doing at that time, particularly around COVID. But broadly speaking, I grew up in quite severe poverty, within eyesight of one of the most prestigious public schools in Britain. So the divide in my life in where I was living between the immense wealth of those people and the injustices of, local kids being blamed for crimes that were committed by the public school boys on account of our financial circumstances, etc., the lack of meritocracy, that stuff all kind of played into it. And I've always been politically engaged. I would say it was kind of the era of Johnson and Brexit that kind of made me get more actively involved in politics. But yeah, it was primarily the lockdown and trying to cope with what was happening that made me start making videos, because I'm not actually confident necessarily. I'm not a performer. I'm not much of a, I've always been behind the camera taking photos than in front of it. But I just felt like I just had to say something and I needed an outlet, and that's how it kind of started, really.
So you say that you needed an outlet to kind of keep up with what the government was doing around COVID. I guess then when you first started out and now, how do you actually stay informed with the different political developments in order to make your videos?
Independent journalism, investigative journalism plays a huge part in it, because they're the only sources that I trust. Outlets like openDemocracy, Byline Times, New European, but also I found kind of trusted sources and journalists on Twitter. And what I tend to do is kind of look into those people, research them, know that they're trusted and verified sources. And then I kind of turn on notifications to keep up to date with what's happening. I mean, it's not as reliable a source nowadays, sadly, Twitter, because of what's happened with it. But that's generally how I get the up-to-date news, which is a bit intense when there's a big news event happening, because your phone is just a mess of notifications just constantly going off.
Out of the media outlets that you have recommended, such as openDemocracy, do you think that there is a need for better funding or better promotion of them? Or how do you think that small media outlets like ours can reach more of the UK?
Well, I think that what a lot of people don't realise is that the primary media outlets are funded by billionaire non-doms that don't even live in Britain, but yet set our agenda, despite not living here, not paying taxes here, and they set the national narrative. So I think, of course, it's vitally important that people support independent news outlets, because it's the independent news outlets and the investigative journalists that are actually operating without fear or favour. And we live in a time when the government are lying, the people that make our laws are lying. So there's never been a more important time to tell the truth and for people to see the truth about what is happening. So that's why outlets like openDemocracy are really important and why people should support them.
I mean, we touched on it a bit, but do you think we need better media in the UK? And how can the current state of the media be fixed?
Oh, God. I don't think that the current government is going to implement any kind of press reform, which is desperately needed. And it's interesting that there's no surprise that they shelved Leveson 2. But then there's the fact that they changed the Official Secrets Act, which was a huge issue for press freedom. I mean, to the point where journalists could essentially be treated as spies for reporting in the public interest. And I know that openDemocracy tried to call for the public interest defence to be implemented, which they didn't when they passed the security bill on this. But I think that what people need to realise is that there's a kind of revolving door with the kind of public school boys or public school people, that kind of the old boys network that runs things, where they have a go at being a journalist and fail, Johnson. Then they go into politics and they have a go at doing that, and then they fail. And then they go back to being maybe an editor or a writer of, say, the Evening Standard, like George Osborne, or writing for the Mail, like Johnson. And that there's also a link between the kind of special advisors or government advisors and those media places. So the entire notion that we have a free and unbiased media is a fallacy. And people trust those information sources that they've grown up with, not knowing that there is that inherent bias and misinformation attached to it. And that's a real problem, because people are being kind of conned by this. I would just say to people, just invest in independent sources, because you're not going to get the information that you need to make a informed political choice when it comes to voting from the current news sources that we have.
And you say that it can be quite overwhelming when there's a lot going on. And I feel like last year was one of the most chaotic years in British politics of like recent times. So what event or what sort of political event out of last year stood out to you the most?
Well, there's a few, but I would say Johnson's the time around Johnson's resignation and the kind of almost like mini siege that went on, where he was holed up in Number 10, refusing to resign, even though I think everyone apart from like a handful of people had resigned. It was just unbelievable that he had the kind of gall to kind of cling on. We all knew he was shameless, but that was quite remarkable. But then it's really hard to choose from Johnson, because he's got such a kind of litany of crimes and misdemeanors and scandals associated with him. But then there's also Truss and what happened with her, and it kind of proved that it didn't stop with Johnson, the corruption, because there were kind of reports in the Times about Kwarteng and Truss meeting with hedge funders at champagne lunches just before the pound crash, and they made those kind of disastrous decisions around the mini budget. You expected it from Johnson, the kind of the corruption and the lies. With Truss, I don't think anyone ever expected her to ever be anywhere near that position of power, and nobody anticipated her messing it up in such a short amount of time. Having to eject a prime minister after a month, it was insane.
And so now that we're left with Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister of the UK, would you be able to choose or compare Boris Johnson to Rishi Sunak?
Initially, at first, I think, like a lot of people, there was not much faith in terms of Sunak's ability. But I hope that he would be a bit more decent on some level, that he came in with those pledges to, integrity, accountability, professionalism. Not one of them have been met. It was all just lip service. And now we're starting to find out about, the links. Well, we knew about the links of his wife with Infosys, and, the fact that they're still trading in Russia. The deal that was made with BP just months before he issued those new oil and gas licenses against all logic in the wake of an impending climate crisis. And it's starting to feel just like he's no better. And I honestly think that he's in the role for status. It's just more of the same. But then I didn't necessarily feel shocked, considering that he was happy to serve in Johnson's cabinet. And I don't think that anybody willing to serve in Johnson's cabinet has integrity. There's that whole argument, isn't there, of, they might stay to improve from the inside, but there was no kind of evidence of that at the time or after. So unfortunately, it's just a continuation of the corruption and the lies, the lack of accountability, and the kind of gaslighting of people, saying he's going to deliver but failing at every turn, and just creating these kind of stunts, knowing that legally they can't implement policies like Rwanda. And I expect nothing less from a Conservative leader, frankly.
And now that Rishi has somewhat pivoted to a war on motorists, we could say, what is your take on that? Do you see it as another example of of
Oh
him
God.
gaslighting the public and telling them like, this is what you want, this is what's best for you? Or do you think it's more complicated than that? What's your take?
Gaslighting being the operative word, with the new licenses. But it's so clearly a desperate move to win a handful of votes, I think, based on the Uxbridge win, which wasn't a resounding victory. It was 400 votes in it, and there was about 17 candidates, wasn't there, on the list for that area. So I think it's just opportunism.
Well, that being said, about it being a sort of opportunistic pivot on his part, do you still think that LTNs and ULEZ will be a key battleground in the next general election? Or do you think they'll just make it out to be one?
Oh, they'll make it. They'll try and capitalize on anything that they can. I think possibly. I know that it's a bone of contention, and I know that it's a controversial policy. It's not like they're just doing it for no reason. It's not like Sadiq Khan's doing it for no reason. It's like there is a massive problem with pollution and air quality in London. I don't live in London, so I don't really feel like I've got any kind of skin in the game in this. But broadly speaking, I know that there is a problem with air quality that is contributing to cancers, to kids falling sick and dying, and that it's a massive problem. But I think they're going to capitalize on the culture war aspect, the red meat issues, the kind of dog whistles, that kind of thing. And I think it's going to be a very dirty fight. And I think that the environmental issues are going to be the least of it in the grand scheme of things, because I think they're going to throw everything they've got at it. You've just got to look at the rhetoric being spouted by 30p Lee and that lot to kind of to get a kind of indication of where they're going with this. And the asylum seeker, the refugee rhetoric echoes kind of National Front BNP style rhetoric. So I think it's going to be probably more focused on that, lest they be accused of being only concerned with the metropolitan London elite that they always talk about themselves. So
for as long as this current government stays in power or exists, if you could get them to stop doing one thing, what would that be?
Stoking hate crimes, probably, because the language that they use is dangerous. It has impacts on communities. They've already kind of instigated a horrific attack with the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill. And the attack on the Gypsy Roma traveller communities was particularly disgusting, just trying to make an entire community of people illegal. That kind of rhetoric led to Joe Cox being murdered. It led to a man firebombing a refugee centre, then taking his own life. And it leads to immense racism and hate attacks in the communities that we all have to live in, but they don't. They don't have to deal with the consequences of it. Attacking people on characteristics that they can't change is abhorrent. I mean, it's not just, people of colour that they're going after. It's any disabled people, the LGBT community. These are immutable characteristics. These are things that people cannot change. And it is literally against the law to judge people based on that, or to treat people differently based on that. And we've got a government essentially saying it's fine, to do that, encouraging it. So yeah, no.
Moving towards Labour, Keir Starmer has seemed to be courting more and more controversy, especially from more leftist members of the party. What is your take on the direction that Labour is heading in?
I think it's actually pretty difficult in the current landscape to really judge what their direction is, because as we know, it's the government itself that is creating the laws, making the policy, and setting the narrative in the media. And Labour are often put in a position where they have to reply to that kind of agenda or the questions that are set. Myself, I was a member under the previous leader. I was a member for the entirety of his I was going to say reign, for the entire time that he was leader, and the same under Starmer. And my view on this is quite pragmatic, in the sense that the leader of the opposition's job is to attain power. Criticising them prior to a record is just basing everything on hypothesis. And there are certain areas that I don't agree with, but I understand the landscape in which they're operating. It's like they're kind of spinning hundreds of plates. they've got to deal with what the government are doing, what the government have done to the country over the last 13 years, and the media landscape in which we operate, which has a massively pro-Tory bias. So you put all those things together, and it's not a kind of enviable position for Keir Starmer to be in. I think he's broadly a good guy. I thought Jeremy Corbyn was a good guy, but I also think that there is a massive problem with populism, whether on the left or the right. You should never, ever make a political leader your hero, ever, whether it's Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I've been viciously attacked personally by people on the left for not still supporting Jeremy Corbyn, despite the fact that he's no longer leader, was then a backbencher, and is now an independent. And for not criticising Keir Starmer enough, despite the fact that he doesn't have a demonstrable record for me to hold him to account to. Like, he doesn't have a record. I use my platforms and any influence that I might have to first and foremost let people know about what the government is doing. And I don't attack my own team, because under the first past the vote post system, it is sadly a 2-horse race. And we don't have, much of a choice. Although I would vote Labour anyway, and I have faith in my party, it's Conservative or Labour. So I'm not going to sit and attack the side that we need in the hope of affecting change, if that makes sense. So my vision is to get the ball over the line and then hold Labour accountable based on what they actually do. But then I think now is the time, if I could advise Labour, to be bold and progressive and use this poll lead to come up with something that really inspires people, because that's what the country needs at the moment.
So you've said before in a video that the British don't seem to have the desire for direct action. Do you think there's any sort of event that could inspire British people or people living in the UK to take a more sort of French approach to political engagement?
Be more French. It's tricky, because I think a lot of our reverence and compliance is linked to the monarchy and also to the press. I think people trust both, and both kind of keep people in line to some extent, which really benefits the government. But I don't think that people are aware of just how much bias and client journalism and misinformation is spouted by what they feel to be trusted news sources. So, and there's also the outlet of social media, which gives people a way to kind of get outraged collectively without needing to take to the streets. But then there's also the protest bills, which I think have made people quite afraid of taking action, because they fear that they're going to be locked up. But unfortunately, civil disobedience works. Look at the Stonewall riots, look at the kind of suffrage movement, look at other riots historically. They have got results. It kind of pressures the government into doing something, because it shows that there is a self-respect in the population, that the population have reached the point where they act out in this kind of way. But also, we're living in a time where we've had the spirit beaten out of us for 13 years. We've got people going hungry. We've got people worrying about losing their houses. We've got people working all the hours that they can just to try and keep a roof over their head, because inflation is making, or the mini budget has caused their mortgage to go up. I think it's a really difficult time for people. Something has shifted. And I don't know if it is the fact that people are online more, or that there's like something like ways for people to kind of have a voice, because there definitely wasn't around the time of the kind of historic riots that caused social change and forced politicians into rowing back on certain laws or policy or actions. And it bemuses me and it frustrates me. Not that I want violence or destruction of property, but I want change. And unfortunately, historically, it's very difficult to attain that without some form of civil disobedience.
Yeah, and I think you touched on already what sort of actions you hope that your viewers of your videos take as a result of watching your content.
Well, I've got a lot of things that I wish people would do. I mean, first and foremost, to realise that politics isn't just for stuffy men in suits. It impacts every aspect of your life. You can't even go to the shops and buy a pint of milk nowadays well, you can't go anywhere, probably afford a pint of milk, but you can't go to the shops without politics coming into it. Politics, it's everything. People are missing out, sadly as it is, on one of the most interesting soap operas you could ever hope for with politics at the moment. So it's interesting. But B, it's not just reserved for the kind of privileged people. And if anything, the privileged people are the last people who should be making decisions for all of us. The primary takeaway would be for people to register to vote. It's the only protest that you have against what they're doing. And I would also advise people to vote tactically to remove a Conservative in the next general election, because our voting system is wildly undemocratic and it favours the Conservatives, and that's why they won't give us electoral reform, which is desperately overdue. Lots of other countries have progressed beyond it. The Tories don't, because it works in their favour. And also educate yourself about politics. Read independent news sources. Don't necessarily trust what's coming out of the kind of mainstream sources, because unfortunately the government is being run by kind of corrupt liars, and they don't make decisions in our interest. They make decisions in the interest of disaster capitalists, hedge funders, and it's a massive con and a racket, unfortunately. But people get distracted by this kind of footballification of and tribalism, not realizing that they're just pawns in the games of people that are ultra rich, whilst we're kind of laying in the gutter, living with the consequences and paying for the consequences of their disastrous decisions. So sounds like a conspiracy, but it isn't. A lot of people are really buying into these kind of conspiracy theories nowadays, not realizing that the thing that kind of looks like a conspiracy is just happening in plain sight, which is that our politicians are bought by billionaires and the ultra rich and the corporations, and they're the people that they're kind of making decisions for. It's quite shocking once you realize it. People need to kind of keep their wits about them. Truth is a kind of rare currency nowadays, unfortunately.
Just as one final thing, do you want to tell us what sort of content you're planning at the moment and what you have going on in the near future for your channel and other platforms?
Well, I'm going to be setting up a podcast in the near future. It's going to be called Dystopia Warning. So I'm going to set that up. But in terms of the next year or so, I just know that it's going to get far worse in terms of the mudslinging. What I intend to do is what I've always intended to do, which is try and tell people the truth about what's happening, use reputable sources in order to tell people the truth about what's happening. Because you did ask about the hope, if there's like a kind of hope for the future of the nation. And my answer to that would be, let's see what happens at the general election, really, before I answer. Yeah, it's going to be a grim fight, though, because they've already kind of nakedly announced that they're going to try and win it on culture wars, which means that more vulnerable people are going to get thrown under the bus. It's going to get really nasty. And we all know that they've got the power and the resources to fight dirty. So it's going to be a real fight for the kind of sanity of Britain, I feel, this next general election. I mean, the polls are looking good, but you can't always rely on them. And it just depends on how low and how dirty the Tories are going to get in the run up to that. I mean, it's already beginning. You're seeing it online now, like just riddled with bots and copy and pasted, anti-refugee rhetoric, some of it wildly racist. And there's also the fact that a lot of us, lots of us that make content like this, are personally attacked and smeared every day. It's happened to myself and other female commentators more so, but they will do all they can to kind of hound you off your platforms with trolling. I've had hand delivered death threats to my house. I've had kind of hacking attempts on my bank, my emails, things like that. So, and I'm not saying it's necessarily, the government doing that. I've got no idea who's doing it. but there are a lot of people that don't want us to use our voice in this way. A lot of other women doing what I do have faced similar. So it's just a case of kind of holding on and trying to carry on despite that.
Yeah, it's definitely a scary situation to be in. So kudos to you and other people in the field who continue, because those are serious threats to your, financial and just financial livelihood and just general livelihood. So
general livelihood, yeah. It's not fun, but I refuse to be. It's my late nan's fighting spirit. I refuse to be bullied out of using my voice or standing up for what I believe in. It's not happening.
Thanks again to Supertanskiii for taking the time to speak with us. If you'd like to hear more from her, you can find her on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok by searching @Supertanskiii or by following the links below this video.